Hello guys, and welcome back to part 2 of my Wargame tutorial for the support units of the NATO side. Today I'm going to be continuing straight on with the PZ MLRS HS30. This is a mortar carrier for the West Germans. It basically is a very good mortar carrier. It comes with 120mm rounds, 42 of which, and has a range of 7,700 meters. It has an accuracy of 3, which is basically as high as most mortars go. It has a HE power of 8, a suppression value of 276, and a rate of fire of 7 rounds per minute. Now, this rate of fire does lack compared to other mortar carriers like the M270 You can see that has 9 rounds per minute, but actually has less range. But if you notice something, the PZ MLRS actually costs 10 less points than the M106, and you're getting a more powerful mortar, which fires slightly at a less rate of fire, but does come with an MG3 to help it suppress enemies, which isn't amazing, but I would say is better than an M2 Browning purely because of the rate of fire. But either way, that's not what you're talking about when you come to mortar carriers. It's their mortar, and the mortar of the PZ MLRS is 120mm, and it gives it that crazy suppression value, which is extremely good for suppressing both medium and light vehicles, and absolutely annihilates infantry. The only bad thing about this particular vehicle, and the reason it's 10 points less, is if you continue to compare, you can see that it actually lacks speed. It's 10 kilometers per hour slower, and the autonomy is god awful on this thing, 270 kilometers. Thankfully, because it has quite a long range, it's a little bit better in that it doesn't need to move around as much. But you still want to keep it close to the front lines to get those small aiming reticules so that you get very directed mortar rounds. The good thing about these as well is they're very good at firing smoke shells to smoke out enemies so that you can advance infantry closer to them. Now, you can upgrade this particular one to the PZ MLRS M113, in which you get the same mortar but in the same carrier as the M106. And that means that you get the better speed and the autonomy. So if you're going to go for a mortar carrier that's a little bit more expensive, if you're going for 40 points, I would say spend the extra 5 and get this particular one with the mortar that's 120mm rather than 107mm, which is the M106A2. It's basically just like a really heavy duty mortar. Then if we continue, we've got the PZH M109G. This has an accuracy of 3 and a HE power of 10. Now, this is one of the more advanced artillery units where you go from being a mortar to an actual artillery unit. But the terrible thing about this is it costs 50 points and it only has an accuracy of 3. Whereas if you go for 55 points on the M109A2 for the Canadians, you can get 4 accuracy. But then again, even if you go back to the Abbott, you get 5 accuracy. The thing that's really good about these guys though is their HE power is 10, so it matches some of the really high quality artillery pieces. It just doesn't have the accuracy to really make that effective. So these are kind of good if you have a lot of them, and that's where the price comes in. So you're going to be buying like 2 of these for every 1 AMX Alpha 1, but in all honesty, I don't think it's that good of a trade-off because the accuracy is very lacking, and the speed is not great, the autonomy isn't great, and the range isn't great. So not an artillery unit I would recommend to use purely because of that accuracy, and the rate of fire isn't that amazing either. Then we've got the Canadian mortars. We've got the 81mm round one, which is more or less the same as the M125A1, so I'm not going to go into that too much. Then we've got the M109 RCHA, which is exactly the same as the PZH M109G, except from the fact that it has slightly less range and a different machine gun, which is what brings it down to 40 points, which makes it actually a little bit more worth it than the PZH M109. Then we've got the Chaparrals. Now these are ones I've been looking forward to going through because they are very good units. They're extremely cheap. You can see these Chaparrals are only 20 points. They have a range versus helicopters of 2,450 meters and a range versus airplanes of 1,925 meters, which isn't a lot, but they have accuracy of 7 and HE power of 5, and they're infrared missiles, so they can't get targeted by radar seed missiles. So that makes them extremely good. Their rate of fire is 9 rounds per minute, but they only have 4 missiles, and basically what they do is they fire all 4 off, one after the other, and then they have to be reloaded by a resupply truck, which can get annoying because they use up quite a lot of resupply if they're firing off all their missiles all the time. But they do have 60 km/h speed, and their autonomy is okay for basically dotting them around, especially for defense. Whereas you've got the M48A1, which has an extremely improved range over the M48, and you've got 3,500 meter range, 2,800 meters versus airplanes, and an accuracy of 8. So you get an extra accuracy, extra HE power, and extra range, and extra suppression. So you're making a huge upgrade here, and only for 15 points. And I would always recommend, if you're stuck whether to bring these, the M48A1s or just the M48s, I would always go for the M48A1s, just because they're just basically a lot more effective. And basically, a really good thing I found with the Chaparrals is that they'll fire off their missiles, and even if they only hit one, and you have like another weaker unit nearby with only like 4 HE power, you can still two-shot those planes down, because this has 6 HE power, which is very powerful for an anti-air unit. Now you've got basically the same hull, so the speed, autonomy, all that kind of stuff is exactly the same. Then we've got the Avenger. This is another good vehicle because it's extremely fast and extremely accurate. You've got 90 km/h speed off-road, which makes it able to position very, very quickly. Then you've got the range versus helicopters of 2,275 meters, which can let it down because helicopters with ADATS can actually stay out of range of this thing, but luckily with the speed you can get it into range in time. Airplanes flying over above will get hit by these very, very accurate missiles, because accuracy of 11 is a 55% hit chance, and then you've got the HE power of 5, which basically allows you to two-shot any vehicle. You've got a rate of fire of 20 rounds per minute as well, and it's got 8 missiles in it. The only trouble is it's not armoured, and it can get killed very easily. This is the same for the Chaparrals as well. Like, the Chaparrals have one front and one side armour, but it's not very good, and they're very, very weak, and they will be one-shot by most things. So do be careful of that. And the Avenger can be taken out by infantry, which is kind of annoying. The thing that I'm kind of annoyed about with the Avenger in Wargame is that in real life it does have a machine gun, and I believe if you zoom in you can see it on the model. But unfortunately, if you just see there, it's got a little machine gun underneath the right side rocket, and it doesn't actually have that in the game, so it's kind of defenseless against ground forces or enemy helicopters that get really close, because otherwise that basically should be like an autocannon or a 50 cal, so it would be very effective. But unfortunately, because it can be killed so easily, they're not as worth it as maybe the Chaparrals. Now we've got the Danish mortars. Again, we've got another one just like the M125 and the M125A1 for the Americans. Then we've got copycats of the M109Gs for both the Canadians and the Germans. Again, both exactly the same pretty much, but again just a different MG and different ranging. And then we've got the upgraded version, which is the same as the A2 version. Then we got the American versions. These are the originals, but again, exactly the same statistics, pretty much. If I just check quickly, yep, exactly the same. The M109A2, already gone over that with the Canadian version. We've got the accuracy of 4, HE power of 10. Then you've got the M109A6 Paladin. This is a brilliant artillery unit. Has an accuracy of 7, which isn't amazing, but is better than the AMX Alpha 1. Then we've got a less rate of fire, but the same HE power and same suppression. It's got 155mm rounds, but is a little bit better in terms of range than the AMX Alpha 1. Now, also what's good about the M109A6 is the main gun is actually pretty powerful as well. It's only got an accuracy of 3, but at close range with an AP power of 16 and kinetic rounds, that is very, very powerful. So if they're, for instance, hid behind a tree line, and therefore units have to move very close to them to get into, like, basically a range of shooting them, then you can use this cannon to attack armoured units. However, it doesn't have a HE power, please remember this. These particular units, these artillery units that have main guns as well as artilleries, they can't fire at infantry because they don't have any HE power in those particular shells. So you're going to have to RT infantry before they get close, and if infantry does get close, the only thing that's going to be protecting you is that machine gun, and I can guarantee pretty much that it's not going to be enough. So another good thing, the Paladin has 2 front armor, 1 side arm, 1 rear arm. Will keep it alive against counter artillery, and it's got 60 km/h speed, which is actually reasonably fast, but the autonomy isn't great at 350 kilometers. The fuel capacity though, 1000 liters, not too bad. Then we're moving on to the M110 American howitzers. These are pretty much the same as the British variants, and well, you've got 2 of them. You've got the M110 and the M110A2, which is exactly the same as the second variant for the British, which I've already gone over. Now we have the ADATS. This is a prototype unit for the Canadians. This has a range versus ground of 2,625 meters, a range versus helicopters of 3,150 meters, and a range versus airplanes of 2,450 meters. And yes, that means that this can fire ATGMs at both air and ground units, and that makes it so overpowered. It's unbelievable. This is what makes Canadian decks good. Has an accuracy of 9, AP power of 25, which can basically 2-shot T-80Us in the front armor. Then we've got a HE power of 5, which is good enough to 2-shot aircraft and helicopters, a suppression of 150 and a rate of fire of 30 rounds per minute. This is an amazing vehicle, but you've got to remember, it's a prototype unit. Now you're all disappointed, because you can't put it on any other deck than just the Canadian deck. So the Canadian deck can be really overpowered with this thing, but it's not going to be anywhere else. I think on the Canadian deck you can bring in about 8 of them. I played a game with them the other day, so feel free to go check out that gameplay. We've got the optics of exceptional, so it's going to be spotting things everywhere, especially in the sky. That's what the radar is for. That's what gives it the exceptional optics. Not good for recon on ground, so don't forget that basically because it says exceptional optics, it doesn't mean it's good recon versus ground, because each unit has 2 optic statistics. It's very confusing, but that's the case. Speed 65 kilometers per hour, which is really decent, and the autonomy of 408 kilometers is actually not too bad, because as long as you keep the resupply vehicles nearby to resupply the HGMs like you would be anyway, then they're never going to run out of fuel throughout the game. So not a big deal. The only thing you have to be worried about, don't get them into range of main guns of tanks, because they will get one shot pretty much. So there you go. A brilliant unit for the Canadian deck. One thing I forgot to mention earlier as well, the M109A6 Paladin is also a prototype unit for the Americans. Then we've got the Vulcans and the Pivads. The Vulcan is a really nice vehicle if you're struggling to defend against spam rocket helicopters. So basically helicopters that have to be close range to deal damage, Vulcans are really good at dealing with. Also, they're very good at suppressing ground units because they have a crazy rate of fire of 1,184 rounds per minute. The Vulcan chain machine gun has an accuracy of 4, a HE power of 1, and a suppression of 92. Now, these aren't great against armor. I don't think they can even touch armor, but they can, like I say, suppress ground forces very, very easily with that chain minigun. And if any vehicle comes into close range with like a helicopter or a plane, they will deal tons of damage. They only have an accuracy of 4 though, which is a 20% hit chance, and that does let them down quite a bit, but if they do hit, they do a lot of damage because the rate of fire means that they're going to be hitting a lot of rounds, and that means that the HE damage will be effective very, very quickly. So something to think about. The only thing I don't like about the Vulcans is that speed is quite low. We've got 40 kilometers per hour speed. The fuel capacity is 300 liters and an autonomy of 300 kilometers. Not great. They're kind of annoying to get around the map, but as long as you keep them near roads, they're not too bad, because obviously the road speed 110 kilometers per hour is perfectly good enough to get them around the map. Then we've got the PIVADs. This is like a slight upgrade. We go from having 4 accuracy to 9 accuracy, and the range gets increased for both helicopters and airplanes. So these are the sort of ones that you want to be using. The only trouble is that the original Vulcan has a non-radar minigun, and the PIVADS does. So these can be taken out by seed missiles. They have a range versus ground of 1,050 meters, range versus helicopters and airplanes of 2,450 meters, which is actually crazy effective because it's almost as long as a lot of ADATS. And it does have that increased accuracy, so it's going to hit a lot more often. And when it does, with that rate of fire, it's going to do a ton of damage. Now, the good thing also about the PIVADs is that they have an increased speed. So to gain the extra 500 meters that you're going to need to get close to those firing HGMs, it's not going to take too long with that speed. And that means that you're going to be able to get in range, and because they're extremely accurate, they're going to deal that damage very, very quickly. And these can be extremely effective if you catch out anyone trying to take out your units at close range with helicopters. They aren't as effective against airplanes, but they can be versus the slower ones. So if, for example, a player is using 1,000 km/h speed airplanes, then you're going to struggle a little bit with these because they won't be able to fire off enough shots before the guys fly out of range. But if it's a slower flying plane, like a 600 km/h speed, then these will have plenty of time to shoot them down, and they will. And they will be very effective, and they're very cheap. 40 points, bring in 2 of them, and that's all the air cover you need, really, plus some infrared missiles or maybe some extra radar missiles. But exceptional optics for the helicopters and airplanes, not versus ground units, and the autonomy of 500 kilometers is also very good. So definitely a unit to consider. Now we've got the M270 MLRS. Now, a very disappointing artillery unit. This used to be actually quite good in Wargame European Escalation. I haven't actually tried it properly in Wargame Airland Battle, but it only has 12 missiles, and the way that rocket artillery is so inaccurate in Airland Battle, even with the 12 HE power, it just doesn't seem to do any damage. It literally just is so pointless, it's unbelievable. The only time I can see that this is being useful is just for stunning troops. But once you've done so, that's it. You know, it's got 12 rockets, you're going to have to reload it, and it costs a ton of resupply to reload, so you're going to be using up your supply trucks like No Tomorrow and your FOB and so on. The range is really nice at 42,000 meters, but the longer you are, or the further you are away, the less accurate it gets. So that range kind of puts it at a disadvantage, which is stupid. You've got a decent autonomy and a decent speed, but if you're going to use these, then get them closer to the front lines, not too close because they do have a minimum range, but close enough so that their aiming reticule is small to do a kind of concentrated barrage, because if you do, then I guess it could be reasonably effective against large infantry pushes, but that is it. I wouldn't recommend picking up this unit. It's basically like the Lars. They're just too inaccurate to be effective in any way, shape or form. That is unfortunately the case. Now we've got the M727 Hawk. This is a first of a few vehicles that you can get. This one's the Danish version. We've got 3 radar missiles, range versus helicopters of 2,450 meters, a range versus airplanes of 3,850 meters. So this is getting close to like the same as the highest book that you can get for the pack side, but it has an accuracy of 7 and a HE power of 7. So the HE power is very good. Like the HE power, it's kind of a bit overkill because you only really need a HE power of 5 to two-shot various planes and helicopters. But the good thing about it being HE power 7 is there are actually some packed helicopters, I believe, with less than 6 health, or 6 or less. So these guys can one-shot them, which can be quite fun. But rate of fire of 5 rounds per minute, and you're going to have to keep them resupplied because they only have 3 missiles, and they fire them off one after the other. So they're always going to have resupply trucks after them. Otherwise, they will just run out and sit there doing nothing. Exceptional optics versus air units. They've got a speed of 25 kilometers per hour though, so don't really take them off-road unless you have to. And the road speed of 110 kilometers per hour. They're very stationary, defensive AA, which are extremely long range versus airplanes, which is really nice. The autonomy of 320 kilometers probably should be enough to get them to where you want them to be. They've got an front armor and side armor of 1, same basic chassis as the Chaparral. Then we've got the M727 iHawk for the Americans. This is the original version. You're basically getting a bit of an upgrade for an extra 10 points. If you see, we can go from 2,450 meters to 2,625 meters, and the range versus airplanes increases to 4,200 meters. We have an accuracy of 10 and a HE power of 8. So even better, but again, a bit overkill. We got better suppression value, 320. You're pretty much going to be, if you're going to be hitting with this thing, it's going to stun those enemies very, very easily. And the same chassis, everything else stays the same. It's just the weapon that changes. And so make sure you keep those radar missiles resupplied, and then you can hit those accurate 50% hit chance missiles with the HE power of 8, which is absolutely devastating and will make people crap their pants. Then we've got the Marder Roland 2. This is the same Roland system that I mentioned before, except from it's on the Marder hull. So if we go back to the beginning, we can see that we have the AMX-30 Roland 2, which is a prototype unit for the French. We got the same Roland 2 system. It's basically exactly the same, except from the fact that the hull changes. So we get an extra 10 km per hour speed, extra fuel capacity autonomy, and exceptional optics versus air units. Now the good thing also is it's got the extra armor, and it's not a prototype unit. So you get the Roland 2 system, which is not a prototype unit. Now you've got to remember this is still a radar unit, so it can get targeted by seed missiles. But again, if you keep these in groups of 2, their HE power of 5 and their accuracy of 13 is good enough to take out any airplanes that come into range before they even start to attack them. So bear that in mind. Now we've got the NM195. This is basically an APC with a Sat-Class AA attached to the top of it. Range versus helicopters of 2,450 meters, range versus airplanes of 1,960 meters. Accuracy of 9 isn't too bad. 45% hit chance, HE power of 5. Now they've got the speed of 65 kilometers per hour, which comes with this carrier, and you've got the fuel capacity of 360 litres and autonomy of 480 kilometers, which isn't actually too bad. Yes, it's orange, but that's only like 20 kilometers from being green, so there you go. This is a really good, cheap, spammable unit for Norwegian decks. That's probably as far as I go with it, because there's so many other AA units that I'd rather use than this one. It's very cheap though, but I just don't like the range versus airplanes on it, and that's why I would prefer to pick other units. Now we've got the Noah. This was, I believe, introduced in the latest DLC. Now, this is a prototype unit for the Norwegians. It's basically been added so that they have a decent AA to defend them. And it does have increased range over the Ihawk. You can see you get an extra 175 meter range versus helicopters, and an extra 250 meter range versus airplanes. So you got 4,550 meter range, which is, I believe, now the max range versus airplanes that you can get on the NATO side. You also get an increased accuracy from 10 to 12, but the HE power stays the same, the suppression stays the same, and the rate of fire stays the same. So you're still going to have to keep them resupplied, don't forget that, and the rest is also the same on the hull. It's just the weapon system, again, is upgraded. Then we've got the RBS 67 Hawk. This is a Swedish version which matches the Danish version, so that's exactly the same as that one. Then we've got the tracked Rapier. This is the only missile AA unit, actually it's one of two missile AA units for the British that you can get on the support. Basically, the tracked Rapier is very, very nice for keeping close to your tanks and keeping them safe from enemy helicopters. But it's not actually that great versus airplanes because it has only a 2,100 meter range, and an accuracy of 10, which is actually reasonably good, and a HE power of 6, which is good for one-shotting those lower HP packed helicopters. Got 14 rounds per minute, and it comes with 8 missiles, which is actually quite good because it doesn't have to be resupplied as often as other AA units. And it's got very good optics versus those air units. Speed of 35 km per hour lets it down off-road, but you can use the road speed of 110 km per hour to get it where you need to be. You got the autonomy of 500 km. That's actually quite decent to enable it to keep up with your tank forces. Now, you've got to remember that the British tanks, especially in British specific decks, they are actually quite slow. So this only having a 35 km per hour speed isn't too bad. But since the latest DLC, the DLC 1, we've got the tracked Rapier FSA. Now this has a decreased range versus helicopters, but an increased range versus airplanes, so it basically switches its role. The tracked Rapier is good versus helicopters. The tracked Rapier FSA is good versus airplanes, with its 3,150 meter range, increased accuracy of 2, so accuracy of 12, but the HE power suppression and rate of fire stays the same, and because it is a radar unit, not a normal fire and forget unit anymore, it does have exceptional optics for those air units with its radar added on. But then don't forget, radar unit can be hit by seed missiles. So if you want to deal with air units, go for this unit. If you want to go with helicopters, go for this unit. Now, if you're making a British deck, generally just take both. Now we got the VAB VDAA. This is literally a VAB with an AA stuck on the top. It comes with a twin autocannon, which have 20mm rounds, range versus ground 1050 meters like most AA versus ground. Then we've got the helicopters, 1925 meter range, and versus airplane 1400 meters, which is abysmal. But the range versus helicopters is not too shabby, but I would never really use this vehicle purely to attack air units. Now, it's actually quite a good supporting unit for ground units. It does only have an HE power of 1, no AP power, so you're not going to be necessarily affecting armoured units. But with the rate of fire of 400 rounds per minute, you can actually take out infantry squads very, very quickly. And that's one thing that I find this vehicle is very, very good at. If you're pushing forwards with infantry and it needs some support to attack into towns and so on, this can be very, very useful. Then we've also got the 90 km/h speed, which actually can catch out helicopters very easily. So if you are in the back line, you spot a helicopter, you can literally rush a couple of these down the road with their fast road speed and their fast off-road speed, and actually catch out a couple of helicopters. Just make sure that they don't target you first. Then we've got the exceptional optics versus air units. It does have a radar on it, it's just not a radar weapon. Only if you have a radar weapon can you be targeted by seeds, so don't worry about that. And we've got the awesome autonomy of the VAB of 1000 kilometers. Then we've got the VLRA Mistral. This is a very accurate AT weapon, or AA weapon, which is good versus helicopters. 2,450 meter range versus them, and if any airplanes fly over the top, then you're going to be able to hit them very accurately as well if they come into that 2,000 meter range. Now 2,000 meters isn't that great, but it is good enough that you're going to get a few, or maybe one or two fire and forget missiles off at any airplanes that are flying around in the area. We've got HE power of 6, able to one-shot some of those packed helicopters, but not many of them because most of them have 10 HP. And then we've got the rate of fire of 6 rounds per minute, like most infantry AA. Then we've got the optics are very good versus air units. We've got the speed of 90 km/h, another really good one off-road, and a road speed of 150 km/h. And the autonomy of 1,200 km means it pretty much never runs out of fuel for the entire game. The only thing you're going to be resupplying with the Mistral is the missiles for the AA itself. Then finally, we've got another copycat of the M125 mortar, the M106 mortar, and the M109 artillery for the Norwegian side. And that's pretty much it for this NATO tutorial for the support units. Hopefully this has been useful and come in handy. It took me a bloody long time to do this one, probably even longer than it did with the infantry one. So hopefully you guys didn't get too bored. But thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learnt something, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.